Street vendor assaulted by mall security. Viral video reveals secret no one expected. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. Imagine standing on the edge of survival, your dignity stripped away, with nothing but a few handmade crafts to your name. That was Martha's life, an elderly woman, worn down by years of hardship, selling her creations outside a bustling mall. She wasn't bothering anyone, just trying to make enough to get by. But in a heartbeat, everything changed. A towering security guard, with no warning, approaches Martha. The sound of her belongings hitting the ground echoes as she's shoved to the pavement. The world stopped for a moment, and one question burned in everyone's mind. Why? Why was this elderly woman treated so brutally, so unjustly? As a crowd gathered, a bystander recorded everything. Little did anyone know that video would unravel a secret no one ever saw coming, one that would change Martha's life forever. The sun hadn't yet risen over the sprawling metropolis of Chicago when Martha Johnson, a 70-year-old African-American woman, stirred from her makeshift bed in a hidden alcove near Millennium Park. The crisp autumn air bit at her weathered skin as she slowly gathered her few possessions: a tattered blanket, a small bag of handmade trinkets, and an old photograph she kept close to her heart. Martha's joints ached as she made her way through the awakening city streets. The aroma of fresh coffee and pastries wafted from nearby cafes, a cruel reminder of luxuries long forgotten. She shuffled past early morning joggers and suited professionals, her hunched figure a stark contrast to their purposeful strides. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the towering skyscrapers, Martha arrived at her usual spot near the entrance of Lakeside Mall, an opulent shopping center that catered to Chicago's elite. She carefully arranged her handcrafted jewelry and small figurines on a worn cloth, her gnarled hands moving with surprising dexterity. The mall's gleaming facade loomed over her, its polished windows reflecting the bustling world around them. Martha's eyes, though clouded with age, still held a glimmer of determination. She had been coming to this spot for years, eking out a meager living from the occasional sympathetic passerby. As the morning wore on, a steady stream of shoppers began to filter into the mall. Most barely spared Martha a glance, their eyes fixed on smartphones or shopping lists. A few kind souls paused to examine her wares, dropping loose change into her cup with murmured words of encouragement. It was nearing noon when Martha noticed a change in the atmosphere. A group of teenagers had gathered nearby, their laughter and animated chatter a stark contrast to the usual hum of activity. Among them was Jake, a 17-year-old high school student with dreams of becoming a filmmaker. His phone was out, recording his friends' antics for their latest social media challenge. Suddenly, a booming voice cut through the air. "Hey, you can't be here!" Martha looked up to see Brad Johnson, one of the mall's security guards, striding towards her with a scowl etched on his face. His muscular frame towered over her frail figure as he reached her spot. "I've told you before, old lady, no loitering allowed. Pack up your junk and get out of here," Brad growled, his hand resting menacingly on his belt. Martha's heart raced, but she tried to remain calm. "Please, sir," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not causing any trouble. I just need to make enough for a meal today." Brad's face contorted with anger. "I don't care about your sob story. This is private property. Now move it!" Without warning, Brad roughly shoved Martha's display, sending her carefully arranged trinkets scattering across the pavement. The sudden violence of the act shocked onlookers, including Jake, who instinctively turned his camera towards the unfolding scene. Martha scrambled to gather her belongings, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, these are all I have," she begged, reaching for a small figurine near Brad's foot. What happened next would change Martha's life forever. In a moment of blind fury, Brad kicked the figurine away and then, with a sickening crack, brought his heavy boot down on Martha's outstretched hand. The elderly woman's agonized cry pierced the air, causing nearby shoppers to gasp in horror. Jake, his hands shaking, continued to film as Brad roughly grabbed Martha by the arm, yanking her to her feet. "I said get out," he roared, shoving her with such force that she stumbled and fell hard on the concrete. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence as Martha lay motionless on the ground, her fragile body curled into a protective ball. A trickle of blood seeped from a gash on her forehead where it had struck the pavement. In that moment, something snapped in the onlookers. A middle-aged woman rushed to Martha's side, while others began shouting at Brad, their phones raised to capture the incident. Jake, his heart pounding, stopped recording and pushed through the crowd. "Someone call an ambulance," he yelled, kneeling beside Martha's trembling form. As he gently touched her shoulder, he was struck by the depth of pain and fear in her eyes. Sirens wailed in the distance as mall management arrived on the scene, their faces pale with the realization of the PR nightmare unfolding before them. Brad, suddenly aware of the dozens of cameras trained on him, backed away, his bravado replaced by a look of dawning horror. As paramedics tended to Martha, Jake looked down at his phone, his finger hovering over the post button. With a deep breath, he uploaded the video, not realizing he had just lit the fuse on a powder keg that would explode across the nation. Within hours, the video of Martha's assault went viral. Millions watched in outrage as the frail, elderly woman was brutalized by the very people meant to protect and serve. Hashtags demanding justice for Martha trended worldwide, and news outlets scrambled to cover the story. But as Martha was whisked away to the hospital, her few possessions gathered by kind strangers, no one could have guessed the earth-shattering secrets that lay hidden beneath her humble exterior. The viral video had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel decades of lies, expose corruption at the highest levels, and force an entire city to confront its darkest truths. For Martha Johnson, the day that began like any other would become the first chapter in an extraordinary tale of loss, redemption, and the unbreakable spirit of one remarkable woman. As night fell over Chicago, the city buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with its usual vibrant nightlife. In homes, offices, and coffee shops across the metropolis, people huddled around screens, watching and re-watching the shocking footage of Martha's assault. Jake, the teenager who had captured the incident, sat in his bedroom, staring at his phone in disbelief. His video had amassed millions of views in just a few hours, and his notifications were exploding with messages from friends, strangers, and even news outlets requesting interviews. "I can't believe this," he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His mother knocked on the door, her face etched with concern. "Honey, there are reporters outside. They want to talk to you about the video." Jake's stomach churned. He hadn't meant for things to spiral out of control like this. He just wanted to help the old lady. "What should I do, Mum?" Meanwhile, across town at Mercy Hospital, Martha lay in a sterile white bed, her frail body connected to various monitors. The steady beep of machines filled the room as a young nurse gently cleaned the cut on her forehead. "You're going to be okay, Ms. Johnson," the nurse said softly, her eyes filled with compassion. "You've got a mild concussion and some bruising, but nothing's broken." Martha nodded weakly, her mind still reeling from the day's events. She clutched the old photograph she always carried, her only possession that hadn't been scattered in the assault. The nurse noticed, but didn't pry. As Martha drifted into an uneasy sleep, the storm of public outrage continued to grow. Local news stations ran the story as their lead, showing the viral video on repeat. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Justice for Martha" and "Fach Shame on Lakeside Mall" trending nationwide. In a plush office downtown, Richard Hartley, CEO of Lakeside Mall, paced back and forth, his face ashen. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. PR Nightmare didn't begin to cover it. "How the hell did this happen?" he barked at his trembling assistant. "Get me Brad Johnson's file, now!" Across the city, in a modest apartment, Officer Sarah Chen of the Chicago PD watched the video for the 10th time, her cop instincts kicking in. Something about Martha seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. She made a mental note to look into the old woman's background in the morning. As dawn broke over Chicago, the story had gone national. Major networks picked it up, with anchors expressing shock and calling for a thorough investigation. Celebrities and politicians took to social media, condemning the violence and demanding justice. Back at the hospital, Martha stirred awake, momentarily confused by her surroundings. A young man in a sharp suit stood at the foot of her bed, his kind eyes meeting hers. "Miss Johnson, I'm Michael Reeves, an attorney. I'd like to help you if you'll let me." Martha's eyes widened with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Why would you want to help me?" Michael sat down, his voice gentle. "Because what happened to you was wrong, and you deserve justice. But there's something else." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've been doing some digging, and there's no record of you anywhere for the past 40 years. It's like you didn't exist until yesterday. Can you tell me about that?" Martha's hand instinctively tightened around the old photograph hidden beneath her blanket. Her heart raced as fragments of long-buried memories began to surface. A grand house, a family portrait, screams in the night. She shook her head, trying to clear the unsettling images. I don't remember," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I just want to rest." Michael nodded, sensing her distress. "Of course. I'll come back later. But Miss Johnson, I want you to know, whatever happened in your past, whatever you're hiding from, I'm here to help. You're not alone anymore." As he left the room, Martha closed her eyes, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks. For decades, she had worked so hard to forget, to disappear. Now, with one violent act caught on camera, her carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling. And with it, the walls she had built around her painful past were beginning to crack. Outside the hospital, a crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs and candles in a vigil for Martha. Among them, Jake stood quietly, his camera in hand. This time, he wasn't filming for views or likes. He was documenting a movement, one that had started with a simple act of bearing witness. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the city, no one could have predicted the shocking revelations that lay ahead. The viral video had merely scratched the surface of a story decades in the making, a tale of wealth, power, and dark family secrets that would shake Chicago to its very core. The bustling corridors of Mercy Hospital fell silent as Michael Reeves, the young attorney, made his way back to Martha's room. It had been 3 days since the assault, and the media frenzy showed no signs of abating. Outside, a small army of reporters camped out, hungry for any morsel of information about the mysterious elderly woman who had captured the nation's heart. Michael paused at Martha's door, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His investigation into her past had yielded more questions than answers, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something monumental. Inside, Martha sat propped up in bed, her gaze fixed on the muted TV playing news coverage of her story. She turned as Michael entered, her eyes wary but curious. "Ms. Johnson," Michael began, settling into the chair beside her bed. "I hope you're feeling better. I was wondering if we could talk about your past." Martha's hands twisted in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you, I don't remember much." Michael leaned forward, his tone gentle but persistent. "I understand, but anything you can recall might help. We need to establish your identity to fight for your rights." As Martha opened her mouth to respond, a sudden flash of memory hit her like a bolt of lightning. A grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers, the sound of laughter and clinking champagne glasses. "There was a party," she murmured, her eyes unfocused. "So many people in fancy clothes. I was young, wearing a blue dress." Michael quickly jotted notes, his heart racing. "Do you remember where this party was?" Martha shook her head, frustration etching lines on her weathered face. "It's all so fuzzy. There was a big house. No, a mansion, and a man. He was angry." As Martha spoke, her words triggered a cascade of fractured memories, raised voices echoing through opulent hallways, the glint of a knife in the moonlight, a desperate run through manicured gardens. Overwhelmed, Martha began to tremble, tears welling in her eyes. I can't remember anymore. Please, it hurts to think about it." Michael reached out, gently patting her hand. "It's okay, Ms. Johnson. You've done well. Rest now." As Martha drifted into an uneasy sleep, Michael stepped out of the room, his mind reeling. The glimpses into Martha's past painted a picture vastly different from the homeless woman the public had come to know. He needed to dig deeper. "Any luck finding that security guard?" he barked into his phone. "No, sir," came the reply. "Brad Johnson seems to have vanished. But there's something else. We found some irregularities in the mall's financial records, large sums of money being moved around off the books." Richard's face paled. "Keep digging," he ordered, his voice tight, "and find Johnson, whatever it takes." Meanwhile, at the Chicago Police Department, Officer Sarah Chen sat hunched over her computer, poring through old case files. Her hunch about Martha had led her down a rabbit hole of cold cases and missing persons reports from decades ago. Suddenly, her eyes widened. On her screen was a faded photograph from a 1980s society page. In it, a young woman in a blue dress smiled at the camera, her resemblance to Martha unmistakable. The caption read, "Elizabeth Hartley, heiress to the Hartley fortune at her 21st birthday gala." Sarah's hand shook as she reached for her phone. This changed everything. Back at the hospital, Martha stirred from her fitful sleep, fragments of her dream lingering. In it, she had been running, always running, a precious bundle clutched to her chest. The sound of a baby's cry echoed in her mind as she opened her eyes. She found Michael still there, watching her with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Miss Johnson," he said softly, "I think I may have found something about your past. Are you ready to hear it?" Martha's heart raced, a lifetime of buried secrets threatening to burst forth. She clutched her hidden photograph tighter, knowing that once this door was opened, there would be no going back. With a shaky breath, she nodded. "Tell me." As Michael began to speak, neither of them could have imagined the shockwaves that were about to ripple through Chicago's elite circles. The viral video of a homeless woman's assault was about to expose decades of lies, corruption, and a family secret so explosive it would shake the very foundations of the city's power structure. For Martha, the journey to reclaim her true identity was just beginning, and the path ahead was fraught with danger, heartbreak, and the possibility of a redemption she never thought possible. Across town, in the opulent offices of Lakeside Mall, CEO Richard Hartley paced nervously. The PR disaster showed no signs of blowing over, and now whispers of a deeper scandal were beginning to circulate. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the room as Martha absorbed Michael's words, each revelation hitting her like a physical blow. The young attorney watched her carefully, ready to stop if it became too much. "Elizabeth Hartley," Martha whispered, the name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on her tongue. "That was me?" Michael nodded, pulling out a printout of the old society page photo Officer Chen had discovered. "This is you, isn't it? At your 21st birthday gala in 1975. Martha's hands trembled as she took the paper, her eyes fixed on the image of a young woman whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Memories, long suppressed, began to surface like bubbles in a boiling pot. "I remember that night," she said softly, her voice distant. "The dress was too tight. Father insisted I wear it. He was always insisting." Her voice trailed off, lost in the flood of returning memories. The opulent Hartley mansion on Lake Shore Drive, the suffocating expectations, the constant fear of disappointing her father, Richard Hartley Sr., a titan of Chicago's business world. Michael leaned in, his voice gentle but urgent. Miss Hartley, do you remember what happened after that night? Why did you disappear?" Martha's eyes clouded, her brow furrowing in concentration. "There was a man, not from our world. Father disapproved, but I loved him." As she spoke, the memories became more vivid. Secret meetings in Lincoln Park, whispered promises of a life away from the suffocating world of Chicago's elite. A hurried wedding at City Hall. "We were going to run away together," Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But then—" Her words were cut off by a sharp knock at the door. A nurse entered, followed by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Martha's face drained of color as she recognized him. "Richard," she breathed, shrinking back against her pillows. The man, Richard Hartley Jr., CEO of Lakeside Mall and Martha's younger brother, stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It really is you," he said, his voice hoarse. "All these years, we thought you were dead." Michael stood, positioning himself protectively between Martha and the newcomer. "Mr. Hartley, I presume." "I'm Michael Reeves, Ms. Hartley's attorney. I'm afraid you'll have to leave. My client isn't up for visitors." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Your client? That's my sister. Our family has been searching for her for decades." As the two men argued, Martha's mind reeled. The sight of her brother, now a middle-aged man when she last saw him as a teenager, had unlocked a floodgate of memories. The night she fled, the terrible secret she discovered, the reason she had to disappear. "Stop," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Both men turned to look at her. "Richard, we need to talk. About that night. About Father." Richard's face paled. "Lizzie, no. We agreed never to speak of it." "Speak of what?" Michael interjected, looking between the siblings. Martha took a deep breath, steeling herself. "The real reason I ran away. The truth about our father's death." Outside the hospital room, unnoticed by those inside, a figure lingered in the shadows of the hallway. Brad Johnson, the disgraced security guard, listened intently, his hand clutching a burner phone. He dialed a number with trembling fingers. "Boss," he whispered urgently, "we've got a problem. The old lady, she remembers everything." Across town, in a penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, a withered hand set down a crystal tumbler of scotch. Howard Hartley, the 95-year-old patriarch of the Hartley dynasty, stared out at the city he had shaped through decades of backroom deals and ruthless business tactics. "Well," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "it seems Elizabeth has decided to rejoin the land of the living. Time to remind her why she left in the first place." As night fell over Chicago, the pieces of a decades-old puzzle began to shift. The viral video that had captured the nation's attention was merely the opening act in a drama that would expose the dark underbelly of the city's most powerful family. For Martha, the journey to reclaim her identity was fraught with danger. But as she looked at her brother's haunted eyes, she knew that the time for running was over. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. In the coming days, Chicago would learn that the assault of a homeless woman was just the tip of an iceberg of secrets, lies, and betrayals that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The tension in Martha's hospital room was palpable as she, her brother Richard, and attorney Michael Reeves sat in uneasy silence. The weight of decades of secrets hung heavy in the air. Martha's frail hands clutched the old photograph she'd kept hidden for so long. With a deep breath, she turned it over, revealing the image to the others. It showed a young Martha, then Elizabeth, cradling a newborn baby, her eyes filled with a mix of love and fear. Richard gasped, his face draining of color. "Is that?" Martha nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your niece, my daughter, the reason I had to disappear." Michael leaned forward, his legal mind racing to connect the dots. "Miss Hartley, are you saying you had a child? But what does this have to do with your father's death?" Martha's eyes clouded with painful memories. "It was 1976. I had fallen in love with James, a kind man who worked as a groundskeeper on our estate. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew Father would never approve. But I underestimated how far he would go to protect the family name." Her voice trembled as she continued. "The night I told him, he flew into a rage. He threatened to have James arrested, to send me away. But when I refused to give up my baby, he tried to push me down the stairs." Richard interjected, his voice hoarse. "I remember that night. I heard the shouting, the scuffle. When I came out of my room, I saw Father at the top of the stairs, looking down. And you were gone." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "James had been coming to meet me. He caught me as I fell, saved my life and our babies. But in the struggle, Father lost his balance. He fell instead. The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation sank in. Michael was the first to speak. So your father's death wasn't an accident as everyone believed. It was the result of his attempt to harm you and your unborn child. Yes, Martha whispered. James and I knew no one would believe us. The great Richard Hartley Sr., attempted murderer, impossible. So we ran. We left everything behind to protect our daughter. Richard slumped in his chair, his world crumbling around him. All these years, I thought. We were told you had run off with the family fortune, that you were selfish and cruel. I've spent decades hating a sister I thought had abandoned us. Martha reached out, taking her brother's hand. I'm so sorry, Richie. I wanted to reach out so many times, but the fear, it never went away. As the siblings shared a moment of reconnection, Michael's mind was racing. Ms. Hartley, this changes everything. Not only are you entitled to your share of the Hartley fortune, but this evidence could exonerate you from any wrongdoing in your father's death. Suddenly, a commotion outside the room drew their attention. The door burst open, revealing Howard Hartley, Martha and Richard's grandfather, flanked by two imposing bodyguards. Well, well, the old man sneered, his eyes cold as he surveyed the scene. The prodigal daughter returns. I should have known you'd crawl out of whatever hole you've been hiding in eventually. Martha recoiled, terror evident in her eyes. Grandfather, she whispered. Howard's gaze fixed on the photograph in Martha's lap. So, the truth comes out at last. Did you really think you could hide forever, Elizabeth? Did you think I wouldn't protect this family's legacy at any cost? As Howard advanced into the room, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Decades of lies, manipulation, and hidden agendas were about to collide, threatening to tear apart one of Chicago's most powerful families. Outside the hospital, unaware of the drama unfolding within, a crowd of supporters continued their vigil for the woman they knew only as Martha, the assaulted street vendor. Among them, Jake, the teenager who had captured the viral video, felt a chill run down his spine. Something told him that the story he had stumbled upon was far from over. In the coming hours, the city of Chicago would be rocked by revelations that would shake its very foundations. The tale of a homeless woman assaulted by mall security was about to explode into a scandal involving one of the city's most prominent families, exposing decades of corruption, abuse of power, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of society. For Martha, the moment of truth had arrived. Would she finally find justice and reclaim her true identity? Or would the dark forces that had shaped her life for so long prevail once again? As night fell over the windy city, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The hospital room crackled with tension as Howard Hartley's imposing figure loomed over Martha's bed. Richard stood protectively near his sister, while Michael positioned himself between the elderly tycoon and his client. Mr. Hartley, Michael began, his voice firm, I must insist that you leave. My client is still recovering and... Howard cut him off with a dismissive wave. Save your legal posturing, boy. This is a family matter. His cold eyes fixed on Martha. You've caused quite the stir, Elizabeth. Or should I say, Martha? He spat the name like a curse. Martha's hands trembled, but her voice was steady as she replied, I go by Martha now, grandfather. It's the name I chose when I left that life behind. Howard's laugh was mirthless. Left that life behind? You mean when you ran away like a coward, leaving us to clean up your mess? Richard stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. That's enough, grandfather. We don't know the whole story. Oh, but I do, Howard sneered. Your sister here got herself in trouble with the help, caused your father's death, and then disappeared with a hefty sum from the family accounts. Isn't that right, Elizabeth? Martha's eyes widened in disbelief. That's not true. Father tried to kill me and my unborn child. He fell when James tried to save me. The room fell silent at this revelation. Richard looked at his sister, shock evident on his face. Is this true, Lizzie? Before Martha could respond, Howard interjected. his voice dangerously low. "It doesn't matter what really happened. What matters is the story we tell. And the story has always been that Elizabeth was a troubled girl who ran away after stealing from the family." Michael, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Mr. Hartley, are you admitting to covering up the truth about your son's death?" Howard's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, lawyer. You have no idea the depths of power and influence the Hartley name commands in this city." As the confrontation escalated, Martha's mind raced. Memories long suppressed came flooding back. The fear, the desperation, the years spent looking over her shoulder. But with those painful recollections came a surge of strength she thought she'd lost long ago. "Enough," Martha said, her voice cutting through the tension. She struggled to sit up straighter in her bed, fixing her grandfather with a steely gaze. "I've spent decades running from this family, from the truth. No more." She turned to Richard, her eyes softening. "Brother, I'm so sorry for leaving you. I thought I was protecting you and my daughter by disappearing. But I see now that my silence only allowed the lies to grow." Richard moved closer, taking his sister's hand. "Lizzie, Martha, I had no idea. All these years, I thought." "You thought what grandfather wanted you to think," Martha finished for him. She then addressed Howard directly. "You've controlled this family with fear and lies for too long. It ends now." Howard's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged forward, but his movement was arrested by a sharp gasp of pain. He clutched his chest, staggering backward. The room erupted into chaos. Richard called for a doctor while Michael moved to support the faltering Howard. Martha watched in stunned silence as her grandfather, the man who had loomed so large in her nightmares for decades, crumpled to the floor. As medical staff rushed in, Martha found herself torn between long-held resentment and an unexpected pang of concern. This man had orchestrated her exile, had buried the truth about her father's death, and yet he was still family. In the midst of the commotion, Martha's eyes met Richard's. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside the hospital room, oblivious to the family drama unfolding within, Jake paced nervously. He had been trying to work up the courage to visit Martha, to apologize for the unwanted attention his video had brought her. Little did he know that his simple act of recording an injustice had set in motion events that would reshape one of Chicago's most powerful dynasties. As Howard was wheeled away on a gurney, Martha leaned back in her bed, exhaustion etched on her face. The confrontation with her past had left her drained, but also strangely liberated. For the first time in decades, she felt the weight of secrecy lifting from her shoulders. Michael approached her bedside, his expression grave. "Miss Hartley, I think it's time we discuss your next steps. The truth is out now, but making it public will have far-reaching consequences. Are you prepared for that?" Martha took a deep breath, her gaze moving from Michael to Richard, and then to the door through which her grandfather had just been taken. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with legal battles, media scrutiny, and the daunting task of reclaiming her identity after so many years. But as she clutched the photo of her long-lost daughter, Martha felt a resolve she hadn't experienced in years. "Yes," she said firmly, "it's time the whole truth came to light, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced by power and privilege." As night settled over Chicago, the hospital buzzed with activity. News of Howard Hartley's collapse would soon hit the headlines, but it would pale in comparison to the storm that was brewing. The story of Martha Johnson, once Elizabeth Hartley, was about to shake the city to its core. For Martha, the journey from forgotten street vendor to reclaiming her place in one of Chicago's most influential families was just beginning. But with the truth as her ally and newfound allies by her side, she was finally ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The city held its breath, unaware that the viral video of an elderly woman's assault was merely the prelude to a tale of power, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family that would captivate the nation. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Martha's hospital room became the epicenter of a storm that was about to break over Chicago. Reporters camped outside, their cameras trained on the entrance, hoping for a glimpse of the woman at the center of what was quickly becoming the story of the decade. Inside, Martha sat propped up in bed, her weathered hands clasped around a steaming cup of tea. The room was filled with an eclectic group: Richard, her long-lost brother; Michael, her determined young lawyer; and Jake, the teenager whose video had inadvertently set this all in motion. "The press conference is set for tomorrow," Michael said, his tone businesslike but tinged with concern. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Miss Hartley?" Martha nodded, a steely resolve in her eyes. "I've been running for far too long, Michael. It's time to face the music." Richard leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Lizzie, Martha, you do realize what this means, don't you? Once we go public with everything, father's death, grandfather's cover-up, your daughter, there's no going back. The Hartley name will never be the same." "Good," Martha said firmly. "It's time for the truth to come out, all of it." As the group discussed strategy, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse entered, followed by a frail-looking Howard Hartley in a wheelchair. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. "Elizabeth," Howard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk, alone." After a moment's hesitation, Martha nodded. The others filed out, leaving grandfather and granddaughter face to face for the first time in decades. Howard's eyes, once cold and calculating, now seemed tired and... was that remorse? "I've spent a lifetime building this family's legacy," he began. "Everything I did to protect the Hartley name." Martha's voice was soft but firm. "At what cost, grandfather? Lives were destroyed, truths were buried. Is that really a legacy worth protecting?" For a long moment, Howard was silent. Then, to Martha's shock, a tear rolled down his weathered cheek. "I was wrong," he whispered. "So terribly wrong. Can you ever forgive an old fool?" The weight of decades seemed to lift from Martha's shoulders. She reached out, taking her grandfather's hand. "It's not just about forgiveness," she said. "It's about making things right." As they talked, a plan began to form. When the others were called back in, they found Martha and Howard presenting a united front for the first time in living memory. "We're going to tell the truth," Martha announced. "All of it, but we're also going to use the Hartley fortune to make amends." The press conference the next day was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. Martha, flanked by her brother and grandfather, stood before a sea of cameras and told her story. She spoke of her young love, her father's tragic death, and the years she spent in hiding. But more than that, she spoke of redemption. "The Hartley family has been blessed with great wealth and influence," Martha said, her voice strong and clear. "It's time we use that blessing to help those who have been forgotten by society." She announced the creation of the Hartley Foundation, a billion-dollar initiative to support homeless individuals, fund affordable housing, and provide legal aid to those who couldn't afford it. "My years on the streets taught me the true value of compassion," Martha continued. "It's a lesson I hope to share with all of Chicago." The room erupted in applause. Reporters fired questions rapid fire, but Martha stood tall, answering each with grace and honesty. As the conference wound down, Jake approached Martha, his eyes wide with admiration. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I never imagined my video would lead to all this. You're incredible." Martha smiled, placing a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "We all have the power to make a difference, Jake. Sometimes we just need a little push to realize it." In the days that followed, Martha's story dominated headlines across the nation. The tale of the homeless woman who reclaimed her place in one of America's wealthiest families captivated the public imagination. But more than that, it sparked a conversation about privilege, responsibility, and the power of redemption. For Martha, the journey was far from over. There were still wounds to heal, relationships to rebuild, and a daughter to find. But as she stood on the balcony of the Hartley penthouse, looking out over the city she had once fled, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in decades. Chicago glittered below her, a city of endless possibilities, and for the first time in years, Martha allowed herself to hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. As night fell over the windy city, Martha Johnson, once Elizabeth Hartley, smiled. Her story, which began with a viral video of injustice, had become a beacon of hope for millions. And in that moment, she knew that her greatest chapter was yet to be written. 6 months had passed since the press conference that shook Chicago to its core. The city skyline glimmered in the late afternoon sun as Martha stood at the window of her office in the newly established Hartley Foundation headquarters. The view was a far cry from the street corners she had called home for so many years, yet her eyes held the same determined glint they had when she was selling handmade trinkets to passers-by. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, turning to see Michael, her lawyer-turned-friend, enter with a stack of papers. "The latest reports from our outreach programs," he said, placing them on her desk. "The numbers are impressive, Martha. We're making a real difference out there." Martha smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with genuine joy. "That's wonderful news, Michael. But tell me, any word on your daughter?" Michael finished for her, his expression softening. "We're still searching, but we have some promising leads. Don't lose hope." Martha nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of anticipation and fear. The search for her long-lost child had been ongoing since the truth came to light, but so far, they had come up empty-handed. As Michael excused himself, Martha's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Turn on the news, now." Frowning, Martha flicked on the large screen on her office wall. Her breath caught as she saw a familiar face. Brad Johnson, the security guard who had assaulted her all those months ago. The reporter's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, former Lakeside Mall security guard Brad Johnson has come forward with explosive allegations of corruption within the Chicago Police Department. Johnson claims he was acting under orders from high-ranking officials when he assaulted Martha Hartley, then known as a homeless street vendor. Martha sank into her chair, her mind reeling. Just when she thought the storm had passed, a new tempest was brewing. But this time, she was ready to face it head-on. As the days unfolded, Chicago found itself embroiled in a scandal that reached the highest levels of power. The Hartley Foundation, under Martha's guidance, became a beacon of transparency and justice, supporting whistleblowers and pushing for systemic change. Through it all, Martha never lost sight of her personal mission. And then, on a crisp autumn morning, it happened. "We found her," Michael said, his voice barely containing his excitement as he burst into Martha's office. "Your daughter, she's alive and she's here in Chicago." The world seemed to stand still as Martha absorbed the news. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Where?" Hours later, Martha found herself standing outside a modest home in a quiet suburb. Her heart pounded as she raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. "You can do this," Richard said softly, squeezing her shoulder in support. Taking a deep breath, Martha knocked. The door opened, revealing a woman in her 40s with Martha's eyes and her father's smile. "Mom?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "Sarah?" Martha breathed, and in that moment, decades of separation melted away as mother and daughter embraced. As the sun set over Chicago that evening, Martha sat in Sarah's living room, surrounded by the family she had thought lost forever. Her daughter, her grandchildren, Richard, and even a frail but repentant Howard. They laughed, they cried, and they began the long process of healing. Later that night, back in her penthouse, Martha sat down at her desk and began to write. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt lost, forgotten, or powerless. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of compassion. As she wrote, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a scared young woman fleeing her past to a homeless vendor on the streets, and now to a beacon of hope for an entire city. The path had been long and fraught with hardship, but every step had led her to this moment. Her letter, addressed to the people of Chicago, would be published in every major newspaper the next day. It read, "Dear Chicago, life has a way of taking us on unexpected journeys. Mine led me from the heights of privilege to the depths of despair, and back again. But through it all, I learned that our true wealth lies not in our bank accounts or our family names, but in the compassion we show to one another. To every person who has ever felt invisible on these streets, I see you. To those who think their voices don't matter, they do. And to anyone who believes that their past defines their future, it doesn't. Our city faces challenges, but together we can build a Chicago where every person is seen, heard, and valued. A city where second chances are given, where truth prevails over power, and where the measure of our success is not in our personal gain, but in the lives we touch. This is not the end of our story, it's a new beginning, and I invite all of you to write it with me. With hope and gratitude, Martha Hartley. As Martha signed her name, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The viral video that had catapulted her into the spotlight seemed like a lifetime ago. It had been the spark, but the flame it ignited would burn bright for years to come. Outside, Chicago hummed with life, a city forever changed by the story of a woman who had lost everything, only to gain a purpose greater than she could have ever imagined. Martha smiled, closed her notebook, and whispered to herself, "The best is yet to come." In that moment, she knew that while her personal journey had come full circle, her work, their work, was far from over. And for the first time in her life, Martha Hartley was truly, completely home.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.